Lieutenant Emma Johnson held her boarding pass tightly, her weary eyes sweeping over the busy airport terminal. After 6 long months in Iraq, she was finally headed home. The weight of her experiences pressed down on her, but a faint smile tugged at her lips as she imagined reuniting with her family. Now boarding first class for Flight 535 to Wyoming. The announcement buzzed through the speakers, catching Emma by surprise. First class? She glanced down at her ticket, double-checking it. Sure enough, it clearly stated a first-class seat. It must have been an upgrade or a mistake, but she wasn't about to question her good fortune. She made her way down the jet bridge, the sound of her military boots echoing against the metal walls. As Emma stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of recycled air filled her senses. The first-class cabin sparkled, gleaming with polished surfaces and cushioned seats. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," a flight attendant greeted warmly. "Your seat is just to your left." Emma nodded in thanks and moved toward her assigned spot. She slipped her backpack into the overhead compartment and settled into the spacious seat, enjoying the luxury of extra legroom. It was a stark contrast to the cramped military transport planes she'd been used to. As other passengers boarded, Emma allowed herself a rare moment of peace, closing her eyes. The hum of voices and the sound of luggage being stowed filled the cabin. "Excuse me." A sharp voice shattered her moment of calm. Emma opened her eyes to see a well-dressed man in his 50s standing before her, a thin line of disapproval on his face. His eyes scanned her uniform, pausing at the lieutenant's stripes on her sleeve. "I believe you're in my seat," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is my assigned seat," Emma replied, keeping her tone steady and composed. She instinctively reached for her boarding pass to confirm. The man's frown deepened. "There has to be some mistake. This is first class." His meaning was unmistakable, and Emma felt the familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She had encountered this kind of bias before, but it never got easier. "I'm aware, sir," she said calmly, handing him her boarding pass. "As you can see, this seat was assigned to me." The man snatched the ticket from her hand, scrutinizing it with narrowed eyes. A flight attendant approached, her smile polite but unwavering. "Is there an issue here?" she asked, looking between the man and Emma. "Yes, there is," the man barked, his voice rising. "This person claims to have a first-class ticket. Surely there's been some mistake." The flight attendant glanced at Emma's boarding pass, her expression unchanging. "Everything looks correct, sir. Lieutenant Johnson is indeed assigned to seat 2A. The man's face flushed with anger. "This is unacceptable. I paid good money for my first-class seat, and I won't have." "Sir," the flight attendant interjected firmly, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. Lieutenant Johnson has a valid first-class ticket and has every right to sit here. Please find your seat so we can prepare for takeoff." The man huffed, casting one last glare in Emma's direction before stomping off to his own seat. Emma took a slow, steadying breath, trying to calm the racing of her heart. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some curious, others uncomfortable. The flight attendant turned to Emma, her expression softening. "I'm really sorry about that, Lieutenant. Is there anything I can get you before we take off?" Emma shook her head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." As the plane taxied down the runway, Emma gazed out the window, her mind replaying the confrontation. She had faced life-threatening situations in Iraq, but somehow this encounter left her more shaken than any firefight. The engines roared to life, and the plane lifted off, climbing above the city and into the clouds. Emma thought of home, of her family waiting for her, and of the man who had questioned her right to sit where she did. When the seatbelt sign turned off, Emma reached into her backpack, pulling out a small notebook and pen. An idea began to form in her mind. Maybe she could turn this uncomfortable situation into something positive. She started writing, her pen moving quickly across the page. "Dear Sir," she began, pausing for a moment as she carefully considered her words. This wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about fostering understanding. As Emma continued writing, she didn't notice the man from earlier watching her from across the aisle, his expression a mixture of shame and curiosity. The flight attendant approached again, a gentle smile on her face. "Lieutenant Johnson," she said softly, "I couldn't help but notice you're writing something. May I ask what it is?" Emma glanced up, a little surprised by the question. She hesitated briefly before answering. "It's a letter." To the gentleman who questioned my seat earlier, the flight attendant's eyebrows lifted. A letter? That's not what I expected. May I ask why? Emma looked down at her notebook, then back up at the flight attendant. I believe that even in difficult situations, there's always room for understanding. I thought that by sharing a little of my story, it might help bridge the gap. The flight attendant's eyes widened, clearly impressed. That's incredibly kind of you, Lieutenant. Would you mind sharing a bit of what you've written? Emma paused for a moment, then nodded. Well, I started by introducing myself and explaining why I'm on this flight. I thought it might give him some perspective. As Emma began to read her letter aloud, the plane hit a sudden patch of turbulence, causing her to stop mid-sentence. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and the flight attendant quickly excused herself to tend to the other passengers. Emma put her notebook away, mentally noting she'd return to the letter later. The turbulence grew stronger, making the plane lurch and sway, causing passengers to grip their armrests, anxious murmurs filling the cabin. Emma remained composed, her military training taking over. Across the aisle, she noticed an older lady visibly distressed. "It's all right, ma'am," Emma said softly, offering reassurance. "Turbulence is completely normal. Just breathe slowly." The woman nodded, her knuckles white as she held tightly to her seat. Emma continued to provide calming words, not just to the older lady, but to others nearby who appeared uneasy. The plane eventually steadied, and Emma caught the gaze of the man who had confronted her earlier. He observed her with a look of surprise and reluctant respect. Emma gave him a small nod before turning back to her notebook. She resumed writing her letter, letting her thoughts flow onto the paper. She reflected on her time in Iraq, the camaraderie she had formed with fellow soldiers of all races and backgrounds, and the lessons she had learned about humanity in times of conflict. As memories resurfaced, Emma recalled her first day in basic training. She stood in line with men and women from diverse backgrounds, all brought together by their desire to serve. She thought of her best friend, Monica, a Latina soldier from Texas who had saved Emma's life during an ambush outside Kabul. Emma paused, considering how to put these profound experiences into words. She wanted to help the man understand that her uniform symbolized not just her service, but the sacrifices made by countless others, each with their own stories. Lost in thought, Emma didn't notice the flight attendant approaching with the beverage cart until she spoke. "Would you care for something to drink, Lieutenant?" Emma blinked, pulled back into the present. "Just water, please." As the flight attendant poured her drink, she glanced at Emma's notebook. "Still working on that letter?" Emma nodded. "Yes, though it's turning out to be more challenging than I thought." The flight attendant smiled warmly. "Sometimes the hardest things to say are the most important, but I'm sure your message will come through." Emma smiled back as the flight attendant moved on. She sipped her water and resumed her writing, describing the pride she felt in her uniform, not just for herself, but for those who had paved the way. Time passed quickly as she became engrossed in her thoughts. The captain's voice eventually crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Wyoming. Emma finished the letter with a simple request for understanding and signed her name. She neatly folded the pages and tucked them into an envelope the flight attendant had given her earlier. As the plane began to descend, Emma felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to see the older lady she had comforted during the turbulence, smiling warmly. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her voice full of gratitude. "Your kindness meant the world to me. Are you headed home?" Emma smiled back. "Yes, I am. After 6 months away, I'm more than ready to see my family." The woman's expression softened. "I'm sure they'll be overjoyed to have you back. Thank you for your service, dear." As they exchanged a few more words, Emma noticed the man from earlier watching the conversation. His face was hard to read, but there was something different in his eyes, a hint of curiosity, maybe even remorse. The plane touched down smoothly, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Emma took a deep breath, clutching the envelope in her hand. Summoning her courage, she approached the man as he was reaching for his carry-on. He stiffened when he saw her, his posture betraying exhaustion. "Excuse me, sir," Emma began, her voice steady. "I wanted to give you this." She extended the envelope toward him. The man hesitated, a flicker of confusion replacing the defensiveness he'd shown earlier. "What is it?" he asked gruffly. It's a letter, Emma explained. I thought it might help clear some things up. You don't have to read it now, but I hope you'll take the time to go through it. The man stared at the envelope for a moment before slowly reaching out to take it. Thank you, he muttered, his tone no longer hostile. As passengers began to file off the plane, he cleared his throat. Lieutenant, he started, his voice low. I think I owe you an apology. Emma raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unexpected admission. Sir? The man shifted uncomfortably, his gaze avoiding hers. I behaved poorly earlier. I made assumptions that I shouldn't have. Emma nodded, appreciating his effort. Thank you for saying that. It takes strength to admit when we're wrong. The man finally met her eyes, a glimmer of respect in his expression. I've got a lot to learn. I lost my brother in Iraq 2 years ago. He was a soldier too. The weight of his words hung between them, a shared understanding of sacrifice and loss that bridged the divide from just hours before. As they moved toward the exit, the man turned to Emma one last time. Lieutenant Johnson, he said, his voice thick with emotion, welcome home. Emma felt a lump in her throat as she stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal. The encounter left her with a swirl of emotions, hope, sadness, and a renewed sense of purpose. As she made her way through the airport, she reflected on how an ordinary flight home had become something so much more meaningful. She was lost in thought when the sound of hurried footsteps behind her broke through. A voice called out, breathless, Lieutenant Johnson, wait. Emma turned, surprised to see the man from the plane rushing toward her, his carry-on bouncing at his side. I'm glad I caught you, he said, finally reaching her. I read your letter. Emma raised her eyebrows, taken aback. You already read it? Emma asked, surprised. I didn't expect that. The man nodded, his face showing a mix of emotions. I couldn't wait. Your words, they really hit home. I realize now just how closed-minded I've been. Emma studied his face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. I appreciate you saying that. It's not easy to face our own biases. No, it's not, he agreed, running a hand through his graying hair. But it's necessary. Your letter made me see things differently. I'd like to buy you a coffee if you've got time. I have some questions, and I'd love to hear more of your thoughts. Emma hesitated, glancing down at her watch. Her family wouldn't be arriving for another hour, delayed by Wyoming's infamous traffic. After a brief pause, she nodded. Sure, I've got some time. They walked to a small coffee shop in the terminal. The rush of travelers moving by created a hum of background noise as they settled at a small table with their drinks. The man extended his hand. I'm Mark, by the way. Mark Davis. I never got around to introducing myself properly on the plane. Emma shook his hand firmly. Lieutenant Emma Johnson. It's nice to meet you, Mark. A quiet awkwardness fell between them as they sipped their drinks. Mark seemed deep in thought, fingers drumming lightly on the table. After a few moments, he spoke up. In your letter, you wrote about your experiences in Iraq. My brother Alex, he served there too. He didn't make it home. Emma's expression softened. I'm so sorry for your loss, Mark. Losing a fellow soldier is hard enough, but losing a brother… Mark nodded, his gaze distant. It's been 2 years now, but some days it still feels like yesterday. When I saw you on the plane, I guess I was angry. Angry that you made it back when Alex didn't. That's completely understandable, Emma said gently. Grief can make us act in ways we wouldn't otherwise. But it doesn't excuse how I treated you, Mark insisted. Your letter, it made me realize how much Alex would have been disappointed by my behavior. He always believed in fairness, in judging people by their actions, not by how they look. As Mark spoke, Emma could see the pain and regret etched on his face. She reached into her Alexet and pulled out a worn photograph. This is my unit in Iraq, she said, sliding it across the table. Mark picked up the photo, his eyes scanning the faces of the soldiers, men and women of all races, standing together with arms slung over each other's shoulders. Their uniforms were dusty, their faces tired but smiling. The woman next to me is Monica, Emma explained. She saved my life in an ambush. The man at the end? That's Ahmed, our interpreter. He put everything on the line to help us. We came from different backgrounds, but none of that mattered out there. We were a family. Mark traced the faces with his finger, his expression thoughtful. Alex used to say something similar in his letters. I guess I never really understood, until now. As they continued talking, Emma shared more stories from her deployment. The local kids they helped, the schools they protected, and the deep bonds forged with her fellow soldiers. She could see Mark's worldview shifting, his old preconceptions falling away. "You know," Mark said after a while, "I've spent the last 2 years angry at the world, blaming everything and everyone for Alex's death. But listening to you, I realize I've been dishonoring his memory." Emma leaned forward, her tone sincere. "Your brother gave his life in service to his country. The best way to honor him is to live by the values he believed in: justice, equality, and compassion." Mark nodded, wiping at his eyes. "You're right. Alex would want me to do better, to be better." As their conversation wound down, Mark reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card. "I run a support group for veterans," he said, handing it to Emma. "We help soldiers transition back into civilian life. I'd be honored if you'd consider joining us sometime." Emma took the card, a smile spreading across her face. "I'd love that, Mark. Thank you." As they stood up to leave, Mark hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and gave Emma a brief, heartfelt hug. "Thank you for your service, Lieutenant Johnson," he said softly. "And thank you for opening my eyes today." Emma returned the hug, feeling lighter. What had started as a tense encounter had turned into a moment of genuine connection. As they parted ways, Emma couldn't help but feel hopeful. If this conversation could bridge the gap between her and Mark, maybe there was a chance to heal even wider division. She made her way to the baggage claim, her mind still processing everything that had happened. As she waited for her duffel bag to appear on the carousel, Emma noticed a young girl staring at her in awe. The girl, no older than 8, tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed, "Mommy, look, she's a soldier." The mother smiled apologetically at Emma. "I'm sorry, she's just excited. She wants to be a soldier when she grows up." Emma knelt down to the girl's level, her heart warmed by the child's enthusiasm. "Is that right? Well, it's a big responsibility, but I'm sure you'd be great at it." The girl's eyes lit up. "Did you fight bad guys? Were you scared?" Emma chuckled softly. "Sometimes yes, but being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means doing what's right, even when you are afraid." The girl nodded solemnly, taking Emma's words to heart. Her mother, watching the interaction, smiled gratefully. "Thank you for your service," the mother said quietly. "And thank you for taking the time to talk to her." "It means a lot," Emma said as she stood up, giving a warm smile. "Your daughter reminds me of why I do this." As the family moved on, Emma spotted her duffel bag on the carousel. She lifted it onto her shoulder, the familiar weight a comforting presence. After the emotional whirlwind of the day, she made her way toward the exit. Her heart lightened with each step. Home was just beyond those doors. Her family, her own bed, and the life she had put on pause for 6 months. As she stepped through the sliding doors into the warm Wyoming afternoon, Emma took a deep breath. The air here was different. It smelled like home, like freedom, like endless possibility. She scanned the waiting crowd, searching for the faces she knew so well. And then she spotted them. Her parents and little brother, all holding a large welcome home banner adorned with American flags. Emma felt tears well up as she quickened her pace. Her mother was the first to see her, letting out a joyful cry and rushing forward. Within seconds, Emma was surrounded by a group hug, wrapped in the love and warmth of her family. As they embraced, Emma felt the last remnants of tension leave her body. She was home. She was safe. Despite the battles she'd faced both overseas and on that plane, she now understood that compassion and empathy could bridge even the deepest divides. Her father stepped back, his eyes filled with pride. "Welcome home, sweetheart. We've missed you so much." Emma smiled, her heart full. "I missed you too, Dad, more than you know." As they made their way to the car, her family peppered her with questions about the flight and her time in service. Emma hesitated, unsure how to describe the unexpected encounter with Mark. Her mother, ever intuitive, noticed the pause. "Is everything okay, honey? Did something happen on the flight?" Emma took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Actually, Mom, something did happen, something I didn't expect." Her mother's brow furrowed in concern. "What do you mean? Was there trouble on the plane?" Emma shook her head, a small smile forming. "Not trouble, exactly. It's kind of a long story." Her father draped his arm around her shoulders. "We've got plenty of time, sweetheart. Tell us all about it on the way home." As they climbed into the family car, Emma found herself in the back seat next to her younger brother. She began recounting the events of the flight. Her family listened closely, their expressions shifting from worry to surprise to pride as she told them about Mark and the letter she had written. "Oh, Emma," her mother said, turning in her seat to look at her. "I'm so proud of how you handled that. That couldn't have been easy." Emma shrugged, emotions stirring within her. "It wasn't at first, but then I remembered something my commanding officer always used to say. The greatest victories aren't won on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of people." Her younger brother, Max, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "So, did you punch the guy?" "Max!" their mother scolded, but Emma just laughed. "No, little bro, I didn't punch him. Sometimes words are more powerful than punches." As they drove through their hometown, Emma looked around with new eyes. The diner, where she'd spent countless hours with friends, the park, where she'd learned to ride a bike, and the recruitment office, where she'd first signed up for the military, all of it felt both comfortingly familiar and yet strangely new. "We kept your room just the way you left it," her father said, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Though your mom may have dusted a bit." Emma smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for the normalcy. After months of rigid military routine and the intensity of deployment, the thought of her childhood room felt like pure comfort. As they pulled into the driveway of their modest two-story home, Emma's throat tightened. A banner hung from the porch reading, "Welcome home, Lieutenant Johnson." Red, white, and blue balloons bobbed gently in the breeze. "Surprise!" her family cheered as they stepped out of the car. Emma blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the love and support that surrounded her. She walked up the familiar path to the front door, memories flooding back. She remembered running down this path as a child, leaving for basic training with a mix of excitement and fear, and the tearful goodbyes before each deployment. Inside, the house smelled of home-cooked meals and her mother's favorite candles. Emma dropped her duffel bag by the door and took a deep breath, letting the familiarity wash over her. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" her mother called from the kitchen. "I made all your favorites." Emma's stomach growled in response, reminding her that she hadn't eaten much since the plane. "Starving," she admitted with a grin. They gathered around the dining table, plates piled high with comfort food. Emma felt a peace she hadn't experienced in months. The simple act of sharing a meal with her family, something she had dreamed about during those long nights in Iraq, felt almost unreal. As she ate her mother's famous pot roast, Emma began sharing more stories from her time in Iraq, the friends she had made, the challenges she had faced, and the unexpected moments of beauty she had witnessed in a war-torn land. Her family listened with rapt attention, asking questions, offering support. Even Max, normally more interested in video games, seemed captivated by her tale. As dinner wound down, her father cleared his throat, his tone turning serious. "Emma, there's something we need to talk about." Emma looked up, concern flickering. "What is it, Dad?" He exchanged a glance with her mother before speaking. "Do you remember Mr. Thompson from down the street? He owns that security company." Emma nodded, unsure of where this was leading. "He approached us a few weeks ago," her father continued. "He's looking to hire veterans, and he specifically asked about you. Said he'd be honored to have you join his team." Emma blinked, surprised. "But I just got home. I haven't even decided if I'm going to re-enlist yet." Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We know, honey. We're not trying to rush you. We just wanted you to know that there are opportunities here if you decide to stay." Emma nodded slowly, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The idea of a stable job close to home was appealing, but so was the thought of continuing her military career. Emma had worked hard to earn the rank of lieutenant, and there was still a part of her that felt like she had more to give. "Thanks for letting me know," she said after a pause. "I'll definitely think about it." As they cleared the table and moved into the living room, Emma's mind began to wander. She found herself lost in thought. The day's events, from her confrontation with Mark to the surprising job offer, had given her a lot to process. Needing a moment to herself, she excused herself and stepped out onto the back porch. The sun was setting, casting brilliant shades of orange and pink across the sky. Emma leaned against the porch railing, letting the peacefulness of the evening wash over her. A few moments later, she heard the creak of the screen door behind her. Her mother stepped out, wrapping a soft sweater around Emma's shoulders. A penny for your thoughts, she asked gently. Emma smiled, grateful for her mother's understanding. Just thinking about everything. It's a lot to take in. Her mother nodded, standing beside her as they both watched the sunset. I can't even begin to imagine all you've been through. They stood together in silence for a few moments before her mother spoke again. You know, when you first told us you were joining the military, I was so scared. I didn't want my little girl in danger. Emma turned to look at her mother, seeing a blend of pride and concern in her eyes. But after today, her mother continued, hearing how you handled yourself on that flight, I realized something. You're not just my little girl anymore. You've grown into a strong, compassionate woman who's making a real difference in the world. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes. She wrapped her arms around her mother and held her tightly. Thank you, Mom. That means more than you know. As they hugged, a sense of clarity began to settle over Emma. While the future was still uncertain, she knew that she had the strength and support to handle whatever came her way. The screen door creaked again, and her brother Max stuck his head out. Hey sis, there's someone here to see you. Emma and her mother exchanged surprised looks before heading back inside. When they walked into the living room, Emma froze in shock. Standing at the entrance, looking a little uncomfortable but resolute, was Mark. I hope you don't mind, he said hesitantly. I found your address from the envelope you gave me, and I wanted to talk to you, if that's okay. Emma's family looked at her, confused. Emma took a deep breath, realizing this unexpected visit might be an opportunity to connect two important parts of her life. Everyone, she said, her voice steady, this is Mark. We met on the plane today, and I think we both have a story to tell. A quiet tension filled the room as Emma's family looked at Mark with a mix of curiosity and unease. Her father was the first to move, stepping forward and extending a hand. Welcome to our home, Mark. I'm Robert, Emma's father. Mark shook his hand, his grip firm. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry to drop in unannounced. Emma's mother, always the gracious host, quickly moved into action. Can I get you something to drink, Mark? Coffee? Just water, please, Mark replied, his gaze never leaving Emma as her mother headed to the kitchen. Emma took a deep breath. I guess I should explain, she began, looking at her family. Mark and I had a rough start on the plane, but something important happened, and I think it's worth sharing. Over the next hour, Emma and Mark took turns explaining what had happened on the flight. They talked about the initial tension, the letter Emma had written, and the change that had taken place. Mark, his voice thick with emotion, spoke about his brother Alex and how Emma's words had made him confront his own prejudices. Emma's family listened closely, their expressions changing from shock to understanding, and eventually to admiration. When Mark finished, there was a moment of silence. Max, who had been unusually quiet, broke it first. So, you were a jerk to my sister, but now you're not. Max, their mother scolded, but Mark raised his hand. No, he's right, Mark said with a rueful smile. I was a jerk. More than that, really. But your sister showed me a better way. Emma's father leaned forward, his eyes serious. What you did was wrong, Mark. But coming here to admit your mistake, that takes courage. Mark nodded, his expression grateful. Thank you, sir. I'm trying to be better. Emma's letter. It made me realize how much my anger was hurting others and myself. Emma's mother, returning with drinks, chimed in. Emma has always had a way of bringing out the best in people. Even when she was little, she was the one who kept the peace. Emma blushed as her father added, Remember when you convinced those neighborhood kids to stop picking on that new boy? You even organized a whole welcome committee for him. As her family shared these stories, Emma felt a warm sense of pride. She'd been so focused on her military experiences that she had almost forgotten the girl she used to be, the one who always stood up for others and believed in the power of kindness. Mark listened intently, occasionally glancing at her with admiration and a hint of regret. When the conversation reached a pause, he cleared his throat. I can't undo what I did on that plane, Mark said, his voice low but steady. But I can choose how I act from now on. Emma, I meant what I said about the Veteran Support Group. We'd be honored to have you join us and share your insights. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I'd like that, Mark. Thank you. As the evening continued, the initial tension in the room began to fade. Mark shared more stories about his brother Alex, tales that had everyone alternating between laughter and tears. Emma began to see Mark differently, not just as the man who had confronted her, but as a grieving brother seeking his way back to hope. By the time Mark stood to leave, the atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. Robert shook his hand warmly, and even Max gave him a nod of reluctant approval as they stood at the door. Mark turned to Emma once more. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Emma smiled, feeling a sense of closure. "Take care, Mark. I'll see you at the support group." As the door closed behind him, Emma's family gathered around her. Her mother pulled her into a tight hug. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so proud of you." Her father nodded in agreement. "You handled that situation with grace and wisdom beyond your years." Emma felt tears well up, overwhelmed by the love and support surrounding her. "I just did what felt right," she said softly. Max gave her a light punch on the arm. "You're pretty cool for a big sister," he muttered, grudgingly. Emma laughed, messing up his hair. "Thanks, Squirt." As the family settled back into the living room, a comfortable silence filled the space. Emma found herself reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had led to this moment. From her experiences in Iraq, to the confrontation on the plane, to this peaceful evening with her family, it all felt interconnected, part of a bigger journey. Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts. "So, Emma, what are you thinking about that job offer?" Emma took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. "Part of me wants to stay close to you all, but another part of me feels like there's more for me to do out there." Her father finished the thought for her, understanding in his gaze. Emma nodded. "Exactly. After everything today, it feels like there's still work to be done. So many bridges left to build." Her mother reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "Whatever you decide, we'll be behind you all the way. You know that, right?" Emma smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I do, and that means the world to me." As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Emma found herself contemplating what lay ahead. Though the path forward wasn't clear, she felt a new sense of purpose. Whether she chose to re-enlist, take the job with Mr. Thompson, or follow a different direction entirely, Emma knew her experiences, both on the battlefield and beyond, had prepared her to make a meaningful impact. Later that night, as she lay in her childhood bed, surrounded by familiar sights and sounds, a deep sense of peace washed over her. The day had been full of unexpected challenges and significant revelations, but through it all, she had stayed true to herself and her values. As Emma drifted off to sleep, her last thoughts lingered on the letter she had written to Mark. Words born from a place of both pain and hope had led to a transformation she hadn't foreseen. It was a powerful reminder that even in the face of prejudice and misunderstanding, compassion and courage could light the way forward. In the quiet of the night, with the weight of her experiences settling around her like a familiar blanket, Emma Johnson, lieutenant in the United States Army, daughter, sister, and bridge builder, smiled. Tomorrow was a new day, filled with possibilities, and she was ready to face it head-on. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called softly. The door creaked open, and her mother stepped in, sitting on the edge of Emma's bed. "I thought you might still be awake," she said quietly. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Emma sat up, running a hand through her hair. "Honestly, I don't know. It's been such a whirlwind." Her mother nodded, understanding. "I can only imagine. You've been through so much, and then that encounter with Mark." Emma sighed, leaning back against the headboard. "It's strange, Mom. In some ways, what happened with Mark felt harder than some of the things I faced in Iraq." Her mother raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. "In combat, everything is clear-cut. You have your mission, your training, but dealing with someone's deeply rooted beliefs, that's a different kind of battle." Her mother reached out, squeezing Emma's hand. "And yet, you handled it beautifully. You found a way to connect, to build understanding where none existed before." Emma smiled softly. "I guess all those lessons you and Dad taught us about empathy and kindness really stuck." They sat in a comfortable silence, the moonlight casting soft shadows across the room. Finally, Emma's mother spoke again, her voice gentle but probing. "Honey, I know you have a lot on your mind with the job offer and re-enlisting. Just know that whatever you decide, we're behind you 100%. Emma nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I know, Mom, and that means the world to me. I don't know what the right choice is." Her mother smiled gently, a knowing look in her eyes. Maybe there isn't just one right choice. Maybe it's about finding the path that feels true to who you are and what you believe in. As her mother's words settled in, Emma felt a shift inside. A sense of clarity began to form, like the first light breaking through a thick fog. "You know," Emma said slowly, "today made me realize something. Whether I'm in uniform or not, I can still make a difference. I can still bridge gaps, challenge biases, and create understanding." Her mother beamed with pride. "That's my girl. You've always had a way of bringing people together." They continued to talk, reminiscing about Emma's childhood, sharing stories of her time away, and imagining the future. As the night wore on, her mother finally stood up, placing a soft kiss on Emma's forehead. "Get some rest, sweetheart. Tomorrow's a fresh start." As the door closed behind her, Emma lay back down, her mind racing with thoughts of what could be. Despite the emotional highs and lows of the day, a quiet excitement began to stir inside her. Whatever path she chose, she knew she had the strength and support to take on whatever came next. The next morning, Emma was up early, her military habits still firmly in place. She made her way downstairs, finding her father at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and reading the paper. "Morning, Dad," she said, pouring herself a cup. He looked up with a smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Sleep okay?" Emma nodded as she sat across from him. "Actually, yeah. I think I've made a decision about what's next for me." Her father set down his paper, focusing on her. "Oh, want to tell me about it?" Taking a deep breath, Emma started explaining the plan that had come together in her mind overnight. She spoke about combining her military background with her passion for fostering understanding. She shared her ideas for working with veterans groups, like the one Mark had mentioned, but also reaching out to schools and communities to share her experiences and encourage open dialogue. As she finished, her father's smile grew wider. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I couldn't be prouder of you. You've turned everything life has given you into something beautiful and meaningful." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." Over the next few weeks, Emma threw herself into bringing her vision to life. She contacted Mark and started working with him to expand the activities of the Veterans Support Group. Together, they organized panel discussions, bringing in veterans from different backgrounds to share their stories with the community. Emma also reached out to her old high school, offering to speak with students about her experiences, both in the military and in handling difficult conversations like the one she'd had with Mark. Her talks quickly gained traction, and other schools started reaching out to book her. Word of her work spread, and soon Emma found herself invited to speak at community events, local government meetings, and even a regional conference on diversity and inclusion. Each time she shared her story, Emma could see how it touched people, how it opened their hearts and minds to new perspectives. One bright afternoon, about 2 months after she'd come home, Emma stood behind a podium at a local community center. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: veterans, students, community leaders, and everyday citizens. As Emma looked out at the crowd, a surge of emotion welled up inside her. She spotted Mark in the front row, nodding in encouragement. Her family sat nearby, their faces full of pride. Scattered throughout the audience were people Emma had connected with during the past few weeks. People whose lives she had touched, whose viewpoints she had helped shift. "Good afternoon, everyone," Emma began, her voice steady and confident. "My name is Emma Johnson, and I'm here to talk about bridges, not the ones that cross rivers or canyons, but the ones that connect people's hearts and minds." As she shared her story, from her time in Iraq to the fateful flight with Mark, she could see the impact her words were having. People leaned forward, nodding in understanding, some wiping away tears. "We all have the power to build these bridges," she concluded. "It starts with listening and being open to seeing the world through someone else's eyes. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Because when we build these bridges, we create a world where understanding replaces fear, where compassion overcomes prejudice, and where we see each other's humanity, no matter our differences." Applause filled the room, and Emma felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This was her new mission, her way of continuing to serve, even out of uniform. She was building bridges, one conversation at a time, That evening, as Emma sat on her back porch watching the sunset, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. From the battlefields of Iraq to the confrontation on the plane, from the letter she'd written to Mark to the speeches she was now giving. It all felt interconnected, part of a larger purpose. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Great speech today. Alex would have loved it." Emma smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. She thought about all the people she had reached, all the minds she had opened, and she knew, without a doubt, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the last rays of sunlight bathed the sky in hues of orange and pink, Emma Johnson, bridge builder and peacemaker, took a deep breath. The road ahead was now clear, filled with purpose and promise. She was ready for whatever came next, armed with compassion, courage, and an unshakable belief in the power of understanding. The sound of the screen door creaking open caught Emma's attention, and she turned to see her family stepping onto the porch. Her mother balanced a tray of lemonade while her father and Max set up chairs in a half circle. "Thought you could use some company," her father said with a smile. As they all settled in, laughter and stories filled the air, blending with the peaceful quiet of the fading day. Emma took a deep breath, soaking in the warmth of the moment. It wasn't just the physical house that made this place home. It was the unwavering love and support that her family provided. This was her solid ground, the starting point from which she could continue reaching out to the world, building connections, and making a meaningful impact. The road ahead seemed bright, full of new opportunities and hope. Emma Johnson felt ready to embrace whatever came next. By fostering understanding, creating connections, and helping hearts change, one step at a time.